Have you ever stopped to wonder what it feels like when heaven no longer speaks? Picture a land cloaked not in darkness, but in silence. A silence so vast, it echoed louder than thunder. Imagine walking through streets where the stories of divine wonders were still told, yet no new miracles came to pass. The sacred fire no longer burned on the altar. The prophets had vanished like distant memories. There were no visions, no revelations, no voice calling out from above. Only a stillness that settled deep in the bones of a nation. This was the beginning of the most enigmatic and soul-wrenching era in Israel's history. 4 centuries without a single word from the divine. 400 years. That's more than 15 lifetimes lived under skies that seemed sealed shut. An entire civilization rose and fell in the shadow of that silence. There were no Elijahs to confront injustice, no Isaiahs to proclaim hope. No one dared to claim they'd heard the whisper of the Almighty. What remained was routine, passed down traditions, and fragments of faith held together by memory. Yet in the heart of that spiritual drought, something unexpected began to stir. Not a revolution sparked by kings, nor a reform crafted in ivory towers. It began humbly, in households, marketplaces, and among quiet circles of the faithful who refused to let their belief die out with the silence. They were not led by titles, thrones, or priestly garments. Their fuel was longing, their devotion born not of ritual, but desperation. Have you ever felt like you're holding on to something invisible, something ancient, without any guarantee it will ever speak back? These men and women had heard the legends, seas parting, fire descending from heaven, the voice of God speaking from a bush that burned but was never consumed. But they had never seen such things. They stepped inside the temple, but could only imagine the glory that had once filled it. And still, they didn't give up. Something deep within them resisted surrender. And from that ache, a vow began to take root. Not one declared with trumpets, but whispered in the private chambers of the heart, "We will never again abandon the law." It was an unofficial covenant, born not of pride, but of pain. Ordinary men began to read the scrolls of ancient wisdom, not to prove their knowledge, not to impress others, but because they were terrified, afraid that forgetting what God had once spoken might mean never hearing his voice again. From that wounded longing, a movement began to form. It didn't emerge from power. It didn't rise out of triumph. It was born from absence, not from a shining temple, but from the ache left behind when the presence once filled it. These weren't celebrities or heroes. They didn't seek applause. They simply wanted to remain faithful, to preserve what little connection to the sacred remained. Later, they would be given a name, one that meant the separated ones. At the time, it wasn't a term of ridicule. To be set apart meant to be pure, devoted, fiercely loyal. They wished to remain untouched by idolatry, compromise, or the cultural decay that had once led their ancestors into exile. They weren't yet the Pharisees who would one day clash with Jesus. They weren't judges. They weren't critics. They were sincere men chasing after a light they could barely see. But even as they pursued holiness, something began to shift, quietly, imperceptibly. Like a flame that begins by warming and ends by consuming, their devotion slowly hardened into exclusion. The boundaries they built to guard their hearts eventually grew into walls that shut others out. But let's not rush ahead. This chapter is not about hypocrisy, not yet. It's not about religious pride or legalistic arguments. It's about the aching silence, about those who still look toward the heavens, waiting for an echo. It's about a remnant who chose to act when others gave in to spiritual numbness. They believed that by fasting, praying, and searching the scriptures, they might somehow invite heaven to speak again. And here in this sacred hunger lies the greatest irony yet to unfold. While they believed they were drawing closer to the Creator through devotion, they were, without realizing it, laying the first stones of a structure that would one day stand between them and the very one they sought. A framework where outer ritual would eventually overshadow inner renewal, where knowledge would begin to take the place of intimacy, where laws would matter more than love. But at that moment, it was still just a trace, a faint murmur of what was to come, a flicker of fire that still longed for warmth, a sincere desire to hear God's voice, not to replace it with rules. And that is where every story begins, not in judgment, but in understanding. Because every tragedy, no matter how painful its conclusion, begins with a longing, a hope, a seed. The story of the Pharisees did not begin with conflict or corruption. It began with silence and a desperate hunger for God. They were not born into power. They held no thrones. They claimed no inherited priesthood. They emerged from the ground up, from modest homes, remote villages, and daily routines. They were fathers, craftsmen, sons, and scribes, men of ordinary means but extraordinary resolve. What distinguished them was not authority, but a deep-seated determination. After Israel's return from Babylonian captivity, the people came back to their land, but not to their former glory. The temple had been rebuilt, the walls restored, but the soul of the nation remained fractured. The weight of exile was still heavy on their shoulders. They remembered the fall. They knew it had come through rebellion, negligence, and idolatry, and they were terrified of repeating it. From that fear was born a sacred desire. Never again would they fail their God. Small groups began to gather, not to wield power, but to pursue truth. Not to lead as priests or speak as prophets, but to learn as seekers. Their goal was to understand every command Moses had written, every instruction, every word, not to manipulate, but to obey. And so began a movement, a quiet resurgence rooted in study. They combed through the Torah line by line, not satisfied with generalities. They asked deep questions. What does it truly mean to rest on the Sabbath? What behaviors render a person impure? Which actions bring someone closer or further from the presence of God? As these questions multiplied, so did the answers. These men didn't invent new commandments, but sought to explain how to live out the old ones. Their insights became what would later be known as the oral tradition, a set of practical applications intended to safeguard the law. Picture a fence built around a garden, not to hide its beauty, but to keep it from being trampled. And these guardians of the word were given a name, Perushim, the separated ones. In Hebrew it meant those set apart, not in arrogance, but in pursuit of holiness. They longed to live distinct from the creeping influence of pagan culture. While Greek philosophy, art, and entertainment infiltrated Jewish life, these men drew a spiritual line in the sand. Faithfulness above fashion, truth over trend, loyalty instead of assimilation. They had no magnificent temples, but they taught with passion in the synagogues. They didn't wield political power, yet their lives spoke volumes. They didn't coerce, they modeled. Through fasting, prayer, teaching, and careful correction, they became spiritual anchors in uncertain times. Many admired them. Their mastery of Scripture, their discipline, and their integrity earned them deep respect. And during this early chapter in their journey, their motives remained pure. They weren't chasing recognition. They weren't defending a system. They simply wanted Israel to walk in righteousness once more, to never be exiled again, to bring delight to the heart of their God. What they craved was not applause, but obedience, not influence, but holiness. Not tradition for its own sake, but sacred clarity. Still, even in their passion, something subtle began to shift. What began as reverence slowly gave way to rigidity. The rules, once born of love, became burdens. The helpful interpretations turned into heavy requirements. Over time, their practices began to obscure their purpose, but not yet. At this point in their journey, they were still guardians, still the ones weeping over sin, still the men who turned from compromise. Still, the people who treasured the scriptures more than their own comfort. These were men who believed that holiness wasn't found in grand offerings or public rituals, but in a life wholly devoted, consecrated, and aligned with the will of the Eternal. Their intentions were genuine, their pursuit sincere. For a brief moment in time, their search for God radiated with clarity and light. And that's something we must remember before drawing conclusions, before casting judgment. Every journey has a beginning, and this one began not in arrogance, but in faith. As time passed, the humble movement that started with study and obedience began to grow in visibility and influence. What had once been simple gatherings of earnest learners transformed into a respected institution among the people. Their voices extended beyond the synagogues, shaping the way entire communities understood and applied the sacred texts. People began to seek them out, not for miracles, but for guidance. They came with questions that the written law didn't directly answer. How should one behave in uncertain situations? How does one live out the commandments in a world that looks nothing like the wilderness of Moses? And slowly, what had started as thoughtful commentary turned into firm instruction. What were once insights became policies. Out of this, a parallel system emerged, a legacy of interpretations passed down from teacher to student, what would later be called the oral law. This oral tradition wasn't found in the ancient scrolls, but it was repeated with such intensity and frequency that many eventually treated it as equal, or even superior, to the law given through Moses. The intention was protection, clarification, a safeguard against accidental disobedience. Take, for example, the commandment, "Do not work on the Sabbath." But what constitutes work? Can one carry a bundle, walk a certain distance, light a fire? These questions led to answers, and those answers became regulations. Each new rule formed a shield, but over time, the shield became a burden. At first, the people welcomed it. They were desperate for spiritual direction in a world overrun by foreign powers and fading traditions. With no prophet to speak on behalf of the Lord, the Pharisees offered a stable voice. Where there were no fresh visions, they offered structure. In the midst of Greek and Roman cultural pressure, they embodied consistency. They became more than teachers. They became enforcers. Not by violence, but by presence. They would walk through towns, observing, correcting, pointing out missteps. It wasn't out of spite, but out of conviction. They believed that even a small transgression, left unchecked, could lead the whole community into danger. As their influence spread, their structure grew more intricate. Schools were established, celebrated teachers rose, debates sparked within their own circles, some interpreting the law with strict rigidity, others with a gentler hand. But all shared a single belief: holiness was tied to knowledge of the law and to strict adherence to it. The oral tradition expanded, eventually covering every corner of life: how to wash one's hands, how to give charity, how to eat, walk, dress, even how to sleep. Every action was filtered through the lens of sacred precision. No detail was too small. Every moment was regulated in the pursuit of purity. But then something began to shift. Gradually, many began to fixate more on the rituals than the reason behind them. Obedience became an external display rather than a heartfelt response. The law, once a path to God, slowly transformed into the destination itself, and somewhere along the way, the heart of the matter, justice, mercy, compassion, began to fade. The words of the prophets, who had once cried out for righteousness, now echoed faintly behind the noise of ritual precision. The emphasis had moved. It was no longer enough to be sincere. Now one had to prove it publicly, visibly, flawlessly. The community began to feel the weight of this shift. Some admired the Pharisees, others feared them. People followed not only out of reverence, but out of fear of failing, of being condemned, of not measuring up to expectations that felt unreachable. Without realizing it, the Pharisees had built a system, dense, detailed, demanding, a system intended to protect, but one that now restrained, not out of wickedness, but out of an overzealous passion for perfection. And therein lies the tension, the fine line between genuine devotion and burdensome legalism. And slowly, unknowingly, they began to cross it. Even at this stage in the story, many of them still carried sincerity in their hearts. They truly believed they were doing what was right. They genuinely thought that following every rule to the letter was the ultimate way to honor the divine. But somewhere along the road, they stopped being just interpreters of the law and became its judges, and that shift would change everything. Because when tradition starts to overshadow truth, faith begins to harden. When outward perfection is demanded, the soul becomes invisible. And when sacred knowledge is used to control instead of to serve, the voice of God is no longer heard. This is the moment when faith, once vibrant and alive, starts to lose its reason for being. To the untrained eye, they appeared flawless. They walked through Jerusalem with quiet confidence, draped in flowing garments stitched with symbols that marked them as holy men. Their expressions were solemn, their speech precise. Every gesture seemed measured. People recognized them immediately. They didn't need to announce their authority. Their presence did it for them. But beneath that polished exterior, something else was growing. The Pharisees had become the gold standard for what piety looked like. They were admired, consulted, imitated. They shaped public opinion on matters of faith. But as they clung tighter to outward appearances, they drifted further from the heart of their original mission. They fasted frequently, but not in private or humility. They chose the busiest days, the most crowded corners of the city to showcase their commitment. Pale faces, disheveled hair, sorrowful looks. It was less a spiritual offering and more a public performance. Their prayers, once meant for communion with the eternal, became spectacles. They stood tall on street corners, speaking in grandiose tones, quoting long, rehearsed phrases designed to impress rather than connect. The purpose of prayer was replaced by the power of presence. The message was no longer aimed at heaven, it was aimed at the crowd. Look how devout I am. Even their clothing carried a message. Tassels hung from their robes, tiny scrolls were strapped to their foreheads, and every layer they wore had meaning rooted in the law. But slowly, these symbols stopped pointing to God and started pointing to themselves. They didn't just want to be holy. They wanted to appear holier than everyone else. Driven by their obsession with outward precision, they began to divide the people. They sorted society by lineage, education, and lifestyle. They separated the clean from the unclean, the worthy from the unworthy. Those who couldn't meet their standards were cast aside, ignored, criticized, or shamed. Their concern for ritual purity became all-consuming. They washed everything, hands, dishes, cups, even furniture, not for health, but as spiritual choreography. Every corner of their daily lives was scripted by ritual. But while they labored to perfect the surface, their hearts began to wither. The humility that once anchored them was gradually replaced by self-glorification. Correction became less about love and more about asserting authority. Teaching became a platform, not to lift others, but to showcase superiority. They distanced themselves from the people, climbing onto pedestals built by praise and pride. The content of their teachings shifted, no longer centered on mercy or justice. The focus became exactitude, precision, ritual performance. Their system grew so strict that even they struggled to keep up with its demands, yet they enforced it on others without compassion. Their expectations became chains, binding, not freeing. Instead of drawing people closer to the divine, they pushed them away. Instead of healing wounds, they deepened them. Instead of offering clarity, they spread confusion and fear. And the greatest tragedy, they began to believe the image they had crafted, that being admired was the same as being righteous, that fulfilling the outer structure was equivalent to having a clean spirit within. At some point, they stopped asking themselves the hard questions. They no longer examined their own hearts. They became masters at pointing out the flaws in others, yet blind to the fractures within themselves. Behind the solemn gestures, pride often lingered. Behind their rituals, there was sometimes a calloused soul. Behind the flawless observance of every rule, compassion quietly faded. They were still respected by the crowds, still revered for their dedication, but cracks had begun to form, because appearances can impress, but they cannot redeem. A polished exterior may command attention, but it cannot heal the heart. A beautiful mask might catch the eye, but it will never reveal the soul underneath. For years, the Pharisees had stood as spiritual pillars in Israel. Their voices held weight. Their example was followed. Their authority rarely challenged. They were considered devout, disciplined men, guardians of holiness, champions of obedience. But then everything shifted. A man arrived who defied every expectation. He had no official title, no elite education, no endorsement from their circles. He did not wear extravagant robes. He didn't claim seats of honor. He didn't quote their interpretations or traditions. Yet when he spoke, something stirred. His words carried a kind of weight they couldn't explain. His eyes pierced beyond masks. His message didn't just inform, it awakened. That man was Jesus. From the first moment he taught in the synagogues, it was evident. He was different. He didn't speak from tradition, but from living truth. He didn't merely explain the law, he revealed the heart of the Father behind it. He didn't impose burdens, he offered rest. And that was deeply unsettling for the Pharisees. They watched him with suspicion, not to learn, but to trap. They asked loaded questions, hoping to catch him in a contradiction. But each time they tried, he answered with a wisdom that silenced them. One day, they brought him a woman caught in the act of adultery. According to the law, she deserved death by stoning. They asked Jesus what should be done, hoping his answer would condemn him. But he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt and wrote in the dust. Then he stood and said, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." And one by one they walked away. Mercy had silenced judgment. These kinds of encounters disarmed the Pharisees, not with force, but with light. Jesus didn't attack with anger, he revealed with truth. He didn't humiliate them publicly, he exposed what lay beneath their polished exterior. And for those who had grown too comfortable behind the mask, such clarity was unbearable. Jesus called them blind guides, whitewashed tombs, performers of holiness, not out of hatred, but because he loved them too much to let them remain deceived. His goal was not their ruin, it was their awakening. In one of his most piercing moments, recorded in a chapter full of warnings, Jesus spoke a series of laments, each beginning with the words, "Woe to you," not curses but cries of grief, not condemnation, but sorrow. The sorrow of someone who sees souls trapped in a maze of rules, unable to find their way out. He confronted their hypocrisy, their obsession with the outward, their neglect of what truly mattered. He told them, "You tithe even your herbs, but you forget justice, mercy, and faith. You clean the outside of the cup, but the inside is filthy. You build tombs for the prophets, but carry the spirit of those who killed them." These were not political attacks. They were divine mirror words, stripping away the layers to show the truth beneath. And while many were offended, some began to awaken. The people, once enamored by the Pharisees, began to notice the contrast. They saw Jesus heal on the Sabbath, touch the untouchable, dine with the rejected, yet speak of God with a nearness, a tenderness that the people had never seen before. While the Pharisees built walls of regulation, Jesus carved out a path of invitation. While they preached separation, he proclaimed a kingdom wide open to the willing. This collision between religion and grace was not accidental, it was necessary. Because it was never just a theological dispute, it was a battle for the soul of the people, and within that tension, every heart had a decision to make: cling to a system that offered status but not transformation, or follow a voice that called for repentance and promised new life. Jesus didn't come to erase the law. He came to fulfill it, but he also came to free it from the dead weight that had been piled on top. He came to remind Israel that God didn't desire hollow rituals, but hearts fully surrendered. And when that truth was spoken, the cracks in the masks began to show. Not everyone turned away. In the midst of religious noise and pride disguised as devotion, there were those who felt something shift the moment Jesus spoke. It wasn't just logic. It wasn't mere interpretation. His words awakened something long asleep. It was as if a hidden door in the soul creaked open at the sound of his voice. One of those who heard it was Nicodemus, a scholar of the law, a respected member of the Sanhedrin. His life had been built on study, on strict observance, on the pursuit of spiritual perfection. Yet something in him remained unsettled. He had seen signs. He had heard teachings that didn't fit the patterns he knew. And one night, under cover of darkness, he went searching for more. He came in secret, not out of shame, but because his understanding had not yet caught up with his stirring heart. Face to face with Jesus, he addressed him as Rabbi and confessed that no one could do what he did unless he came from God. Jesus didn't flatter him for his intellect. He didn't praise his status. He spoke straight to the soul. You must be born again. Nicodemus was confused. How could a grown man start over? But the message was unmistakable. This was not about religion. This was about transformation. It wasn't enough to know. One had to be made new from the inside out. Their conversation wasn't a confrontation. It was an invitation. A spark lit in the heart of a Pharisee who was looking for more than answers. He was searching for truth. And years later, Nicodemus returned. When others had fled, when even the disciples were scattered in fear, he stood present. Alongside Joseph of Arimathea, he came to care for the crucified body of Jesus, washing, wrapping, and burying him with honor. A quiet act, but deeply profound. The seed of faith that once grew in secret now bore public fruit. There was also Gamaliel, a wise and honored teacher, a Pharisee, a respected voice in the Sanhedrin. When the early followers of Jesus were arrested for spreading his message, many demanded their punishment. But Gamaliel stood up. He reminded the council with calm authority that if this movement was from men, it would fall on its own. But if it was truly from God, resisting it would be resisting God himself. He didn't openly declare allegiance, but his words slowed the storm. His discernment prevented injustice. And then came Saul of Tarsus, a student of Gamaliel, a fierce defender of the law, a sworn enemy of the followers of Jesus. He believed he was upholding truth, but on a dusty road to Damascus, he was struck by a blinding light and a voice that pierced deeper than any law could reach. "Why are you persecuting me?" asked the one he thought he opposed. That encounter changed everything. Saul became Paul, from rigid Pharisee to radical preacher of grace, from enemy of the gospel to its loudest herald. His life became living proof that even the hardest hearts can be softened, that even those bound in legalism can become vessels of love. These are not exceptions. They are reminders. Echoes of mercy can still break through even the strongest walls of ritual and religion, because even in the shadows there are always hearts that recognize light when it shines before them. Every system built on appearances will eventually collapse, and that day, once thought impossible, finally came. The year was AD 70. The streets of Jerusalem burned. Roman soldiers tore through the city, crushing its walls and reducing its pride to rubble. The temple, center of Jewish life for generations, was consumed by fire. Not one stone remained upon another. It was not a sudden disaster, but the result of years of resistance, misplaced alliances, hardened hearts, and rejected warnings. The signs had been clear. The warnings were given, but they were ignored. With the temple's fall, everything changed. Sacrifices ceased. The priesthood vanished. The rituals that had defined Jewish worship for centuries were brought to an abrupt end. The sound of the shofar no longer echoed through the courts. Pilgrims no longer journeyed to Jerusalem. The altar was gone, reduced to ashes. It was not just the destruction of a building, it was the end of an era. For the Pharisees, long operating at the periphery of temple authority, a new crisis emerged. Their voices still carried weight, but the platform that had validated their influence no longer existed. The center of their religious world had been reduced to smoke and ruins, and yet they endured. Unlike the Sadducees, whose influence was tied directly to the temple and the priesthood, the Pharisees had built something different. Their strength lay not in rituals of sacrifice, but in study, in scripture, in the everyday application of divine instruction. They needed no altar, no incense, no sacred architecture. Their foundation was the Word, and fire cannot consume the Word. From this devastation began a quiet but transformative shift. Homes became classrooms, synagogues replaced the temple, the debates of scholars took the place of sacrifices, and the oral traditions, once spoken and passed down, were gradually compiled and written down. From this effort came the Mishnah, and later, the Talmud. What we now know as Rabbinic Judaism was born from the ruins of crisis. What seemed like the end became the beginning of something new. Not every Pharisee remained on this path, but many of their principles shaped the spiritual framework of future generations. Yet even in this survival, this impressive adaptation, something vital remained at risk. It's one thing to preserve knowledge, it's another to preserve purpose. The destruction of the temple wasn't just a national tragedy, it was a spiritual alarm. Those who had witnessed the ministry of Jesus remembered his words with haunting clarity. Not one stone will be left upon another. What once sounded like poetic warning had become a literal reality. The city that rejected the prophets, the city that rejected the Messiah, now lay in ruins. Grief filled the air. Families mourned their losses. Survivors wandered through the debris, stunned, unable to comprehend how quickly everything had fallen apart. The temple's gold was looted, its pillars destroyed, its records lost to the flames. And yet, amid the chaos, one truth lingered. They needed more than restoration of buildings. They needed a renewal of spirit. The destruction of the temple marked the end of the sacrificial age. With no altar, there could be no offering for sin. With no priesthood, no intercessor remained. And so the people asked the question that echoed through the rising smoke: where is God now? And the answer could not be found in stones or systems. The answer was a promise. For though the temple had fallen, the presence of God was never bound to a place. The one who once walked among them had already revealed a new way, a new connection, a new covenant. Yes, the collapse was devastating. But for those with eyes to see, it was also the beginning of a deeper revelation, that God does not dwell in buildings made by hands, but in hearts made willing by grace. Sometimes, only when what's external is shattered, can what's eternal be revealed. Ancient stories don't just speak of what was, they speak of who we are. They confront us, they challenge us. And few do this more powerfully than the story of the Pharisees. For generations, their name has been synonymous with hypocrisy, empty religiosity, and soulless legalism. But when we step back and examine their journey from beginning to end, what we see is not a villain's caricature, but a mirror, a caution, a reflection many would rather avoid. The Pharisees didn't begin in darkness. Their roots were noble. They longed to preserve the spiritual identity of their people, to guard against error, to honor God in every detail of life. But along the way, Something essential was lost. Passion became performance. Zeal turned to arrogance. Devotion morphed into display. And that drift is more common than we think. We live in a different age, with new languages, cultures, and challenges. But the human heart remains the same. The craving for recognition, the impulse to judge, the desire to feel superior because of outward deeds. These haven't disappeared, they've simply taken new forms. Today we don't wear embroidered robes or stand in golden temples, but we do have platforms, microphones, digital stages. Many appear spiritual on the outside, while their inner life is dry and weary. The temptation to turn faith into performance is still very much alive. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson the Pharisees leave behind, the dangerous and seductive gap between looking holy and being whole. True spirituality doesn't need applause. Authentic humility doesn't seek an audience. Real obedience isn't measured by external rituals, but by visible fruit: love, justice, truth. Jesus never condemned the desire to be holy. He exposed the hypocrisy behind it. He didn't reject discipline, he confronted the duality. He called out the stage play of religion not to shame, but to awaken, because the more beautiful a mask becomes, the harder it is to remove. Pharisaism didn't die with Jerusalem. It simply changed clothes. It now lives in modern churches, in curated social feeds, in eloquent sermons, and even in whispered prayers. Every time we seek to be seen more than to be changed, we repeat their mistake. Every time we use faith to control rather than serve, we echo their legacy. But there is hope. Just as there were Pharisees who listened, who searched in secret, who left behind comfort to embrace truth, so too today, there are those within rigid systems longing for a real encounter with God. Amid the noise, they can still hear the whisper of the Spirit. They know faith isn't about checking boxes, but about walking daily with the one who calls us by name. The stories of Nicodemus, Gamaliel, and Saul turned Paul aren't exceptions meant to be admired from afar. They are open invitations. Paths for any who are willing to lay down pride and embrace grace, because transformation is always possible when the heart is sincere. And this is where the story turns personal. Who are you in this narrative? Are you the one pointing fingers? The one repeating formulas? The one preserving a facade? Or are you, like Nicodemus, daring to search in the dark, even if it means questioning everything you've known? Are you ready to let the mask fall? It's not easy. Authenticity is costly. It requires courage, but it also brings freedom. The freedom to stop living for approval and start walking in integrity before God. Because in the end, He isn't moved by your reputation, your performance, or your curated image. He looks at your heart. And if the heart is open, He does what no one else can do. He cleanses it, He renews it, He transforms it from the inside out. The Pharisees longed for a glorious Messiah, surrounded by power, reinforcing their system. But what they received was a humble carpenter, dining with the broken and calling the kingdom a hidden treasure. They didn't recognize Him, not because they lacked information, but because their pride blinded them. Are we doing the same? Are we so busy defending systems, agendas, and traditions that we forget to look at the center, at Christ? Not Christ as a concept, a symbol, or a sermon illustration, but Christ as living presence. As a teacher who still whispers, "Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart," the mirror of the centuries stands before us. The question is no longer what the Pharisees did. The question is, are we doing the same? Religion without compassion, ritual without purpose, words without action. The temple fell, but the message remains. Tradition has value, but it must never replace encounter. Knowledge is powerful, but without love, it is empty. The story of the Pharisees is not ancient history. It is a timeless warning, a voice still echoing through the ages, calling out, "Don't settle for looking holy. Be holy."